Muy buenos días a todas y a todos. En este momento estamos ya en 195 participantes y seguramente habrá más. Es un placer para nosotros anunciarles la conferencia del doctor Stephen Ball sobre un tema altamente atractivo por estos días como dinero o ideas, la lucha por el sentido en la universidad neoliberal. Voy a explicar brevemente cómo trabajaremos en este momento, en este primer momento. Hará la apertura y saludará la coordinadora del núcleo de posgrado en educación y la doctora Liliana Martignoni y la doctora Andrea Díaz, directora del núcleo de estudios educacionales y sociales de la Facultad de Ciencias Humanas de la Universidad Nacional del Centro. Posteriormente, saludará también la magíster María Mérega del Programa de Internacionalización de la Educación Superior y la Cooperación Internacional de la Secretaría de Políticas Universitarias del Ministerio de Educación de la Nación. Con posterioridad haré la presentación más formal del doctor Stephen Ball. Quiero anunciarles además que después de la conferencia tendremos un espacio para las preguntas, de modo que ustedes pueden ir colocando las preguntas en el chat y vamos a ir recogiendo esas preguntas para luego ir formulándoselas al doctor Stephen Ball. Muchas gracias por estar y le doy la palabra ahora a la doctora Liliana Martignoni.
Bueno, buenos días a todas y todos. Muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos. En nombre del posgrado en educación y también del Núcleo de Estudios Educacionales y Sociales de la Facultad de Ciencias Humanas de la Universidad Nacional del Centro, deseamos expresar nuestra inmensa alegría y agradecer al doctor Stephen Ball por su generosidad de seguir compartiendo con nosotros, esta vez un poquito más de cerca, sus reflexiones teórico-metodológicas y epistemológicas que tanto abonan al campo de las ciencias sociales en general y de la educación en particular. Sus producciones constituyen una gran fuente de inspiración de alumnos, de graduados, de docentes e investigadores que transitan por tantas otras carreras de grado, posgrado y espacios de producción de conocimiento de la Argentina y de América Latina. A nuestra colega y una de las intérpretes más importantes de las obras de Stephen Ball en la región, a la doctora Estela Miranda, muchas gracias, Estela, y a través tuyo al Núcleo de Estudios e Investigaciones en Educación Superior del Mercosur, el NEIES, por la invalorable colaboración que han tenido para que la conferencia de hoy pudiera concretarse. Ella, como corresponde, será quien lo acompañe durante su exposición, como acaba de mencionar, junto a la colaboración de Florencia de Galvani y Eugenia Pinali, quienes estarán a cargo de la traducción en simultáneo. Por último, quisiera agradecer también y muy especialmente al Rectorado y a la Facultad de Ciencias Humanas, a través de su Secretaría de Investigación y Posgrado y al área de Comunicación Estratégica, su colaboración en el armado tecnológico del encuentro de hoy. Así que muchísimas gracias por todo.
Muchas gracias, Liliana. Le damos la palabra a Andrea Díaz, a la doctora Andrea Díaz, que es la directora del Núcleo de Estudios Educacionales y Sociales de la Facultad de Ciencias Humanas de la Universidad Nacional del Centro de la Provincia de Buenos Aires. Sí, Andrea, te escuchamos.
Buenos días a todos, a todas. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Bueno, también queremos agradecer a las instituciones, a las asociaciones y redes que nos acompañan con su adhesión, con su aval académico, ¿no? Entre ellas, las que hemos recibido, a la Sociedad Argentina de Investigadores en Educación, la SAIE, la Red Latinoamericana de Estudios Epistemológicos en Política Educativa, RELEPE, la Sociedad Brasilera de Educación Comparada, la Comisión de Investigaciones Científicas de la Provincia de Buenos Aires, SIGBA, la Universidad de Paso Fundo, su programa de posgraduación, la Universidad Católica de Brasilia, su programa de maestría y doctorado en educación, la Universidad de 3 de Febrero, el Núcleo Interdisciplinario de Formación y Estudios para el Desarrollo de la Educación y el doctorado en Política y Gestión de la Educación Superior. La Universidad Nacional de La Plata, la maestría en educación de dicha universidad y el doctorado en ciencias de la educación. Las universidades nacionales de 3 de febrero, Lanús y San Martín, el programa interuniversitario de doctorado en educación de dichas universidades. La Universidad Nacional de Córdoba, ¿no? Concretamente la Facultad de Filosofía y Humanidades, la especialización en asesoramiento y gestión pedagógica, la maestría en pedagogía y la Facultad de Ciencias Económicas de dicha universidad. La Universidad Nacional de Jujuy, su doctorado en Ciencias Sociales, la Universidad Nacional de La Matanza, la maestría en Gestión de la Educación Superior, la Universidad de San Luis, la Facultad de Humanidades y también la Secretaría de Posgrado de dicha universidad, la Universidad de la República, ¿no? Uruguay, su maestría en Docencia Universitaria y el doctorado en Educación, y la Unidad de Prorectorado de Enseñanza. También nos acompaña la Universidad Nacional de Santiago del Estero, con su Escuela de Innovación Educativa, la Universidad Nacional de Chilecito, en La Rioja, Argentina, el doctorado en Educación de Jóvenes y Adultos, entre otras instituciones que manifestaron su aval y declararon de interés académico esta conferencia magistral del doctor Stephen Ball. A todas ellas, muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Andrea. Le damos la palabra ahora a la magíster María Mérega del Programa de Internacionalización de la Educación Superior y Cooperación Internacional de la Secretaría de Políticas Universitarias del Ministerio de Educación de la Nación.
Bien, buen día. Muchas gracias a todos y todas por estar aquí presentes. Me toca brevemente brindarle a esta vasta audiencia algo de información sobre el trabajo que venimos llevando adelante desde Mercosur Educativo, un espacio que es política de Estado desde su creación hace 31 años y donde como miembros plenos, junto con Paraguay, Uruguay y Brasil, proyectamos y validamos nuestras políticas educativas nacionales. A esa comunidad educativa le ha guiado en particular un fuerte compromiso por la integración regional universitaria, habiendo alcanzado logros significativos entre los que podemos mencionar la acreditación regional de la calidad y la movilidad académica regional. Toda esta tarea se estructura bajo la órbita de funcionamiento de la Comisión de Área de Educación Superior, área que queda conformada por los equipos de gobierno, de gestión de gobierno de la educación superior de los ministerios de educación de cada país. Y dentro de ese espacio, uno de los grupos de trabajo específico es el NEIES, que es el Núcleo de Estudios e Investigaciones en Educación Superior, creado a partir del Plan Estratégico 2006-2010 del sector educativo del Mercosur, desde donde intentamos promover una reflexión permanente sobre el rol y el espíritu que guía la educación superior, impulsar la producción de conocimiento desde la educación superior para la formulación de políticas públicas del sector, y sobre todo hacer foco en la creación y consolidación de los vínculos académicos de investigación en instituciones de educación superior para la integración regional. En esta línea es que se ha financiado en forma sostenida redes académicas de investigación en temas de educación superior en el Mercosur y en Latinoamérica, y se han promovido diversos cursos, seminarios y publicaciones también con socios fuera de la región. Particularmente desde el núcleo se viene promoviendo y consolidando un dispositivo de diseminación de estos estudios y de visibilización, que es la revista Integración y Conocimiento, que muchos de ustedes conocerán, que está coordinada con el incansable esfuerzo de la doctora Estela Miranda y su equipo con asiento en la Universidad Nacional de Córdoba. Tiene 2 tiradas anuales con 5 indexaciones de relevancia y también se encuentra referenciada en bases de datos académicas, cuenta con un consejo editorial con destacados investigadores de larga trayectoria en el campo de la educación superior y un comité científico también con destacadas figuras del mismo campo, nacionales y extranjeros. Es por ello que, sin distraer más la atención de ustedes y para dar paso a lo más importante del día de hoy, que es la conferencia del doctor Ball, quien con gran generosidad acudió a este llamado desde nuestra región, para compartir miradas, reflexiones tan importantes en estos momentos para repensar nuestro rol, nuestro sentido, ¿no? ¿Cuál es el sentido a las puertas de la Conferencia Mundial de Educación Superior que se está llevando a cabo la semana que viene en Barcelona? Y agradeciendo también a la Universidad del Centro de la Provincia de Buenos Aires por todo puesto a disposición en el día de hoy es que los invitamos a visitar el sitio del núcleo, donde están todas las publicaciones de acceso libre y gratuito. La página es nemercosur.ciu.edu.ar, y acceder también desde allá a la revista, animarse a enviar artículos, que está abierta está abierta en forma permanente, y en definitiva formar parte de este espacio de construcción de comunidad que piensa junto a la universidad en la región y a la región desde la universidad. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias, María. Bueno, a continuación entonces voy a hacer la presentación de la conferencia, y ya tenemos 233 participantes conectados. Volver a agradecerle al doctor Stephen Ball esta generosa aceptación de compartir la conferencia. Bueno, podríamos, cuando preparaba estas palabras que iba a pronunciar, pensaba, bueno, a ver, ¿desde cuándo lo conocemos a Stephen Ball, ¿no? Al doctor Stephen Ball. Y bueno, lo conocimos al primer Stephen Ball, allá por fines de los años 80, comienzo de los 90, y el texto con el que lo conocimos es Micropolítica de la Escuela, y ya tiene 35 años de vigencia a partir de que Paidós publicó la obra en español. Pero después nos encontramos con la teoría, nos encontramos nuevamente con él, con la teoría social y el análisis de política educacional, y aprendimos con él a analizar la educación más allá de los estados nacionales, en los movimientos globales de las reformas de la educación, los cambios en el gobierno de la educación y los nuevos modos que asumen los estados. La emergencia de nuevos actores en las decisiones de políticas educativas, o lo que él llama la privatización de las políticas educativas. Nos dio herramienta para pensar los nuevos modos de privatización de la educación en nuestros países, como lógica y racionalidad global del neoliberalismo, como una tecnología que circula, se mueve por el mundo, asumiendo diferentes formas, como la nueva filantropía, con diversos actores, instituciones, empresas, bancos, think tanks, que tienen intereses diversos en diferentes privatizaciones. En definitiva, nos da herramienta para desnaturalizar el neoliberalismo en la economía, en el Estado y en nuestras relaciones sociales cotidianas. Pero también nos brinda categorías teóricas desde la sociología política, y en particular los métodos de Michel Foucault y Pierre Bourdieu, pero no solamente. Las teorías feministas, Nancy Fraser, Judith Butler, están presentes en su obra. Desde esas categorías teóricas y las herramientas etnográficas, podemos interpretar la universidad como institución y nuestro trabajo como docentes investigadores en la universidad. Las variadas formas de accountability que vivimos en nuestro cotidiano. ¿A cuántas formas de evaluaciones estamos sometidos? ¿Cuántos papers en revistas de alto impacto necesitamos publicar? ¿En qué lugar del ranking aparecen ubicadas las universidades de Argentina, Brasil, Colombia, México, etcétera? ¿Pueden las universidades latinoamericanas y caribeñas, muy diversas en culturas institucionales, en historias, en territorios, en población, competir con las llamadas universidades de clase mundial? La próxima semana, como bien mencionaba recién María, se celebra en Barcelona, del 18 al 20, la tercera Conferencia Mundial de Educación Superior organizada por UNESCO. Esta disputa, o la disputa por el sentido de la universidad, va a estar muy presente en ese evento. Una lucha que los latinoamericanos y caribeños venimos dando desde mediados de la década de los 90. Porque estamos convencidos de que la educación superior es un derecho humano y universal, un bien público social y un deber de los estados, tal como quedó plasmado en las declaraciones finales de las 3 conferencias regionales: La Habana, Cuba, 1998, Cartagena de India, 2008, y la Universidad Nacional de Córdoba, Argentina, en 2018. Ahora estamos en un contexto diferente, muy complejo. La pandemia, la pospandemia, gobiernos de derecha, o una derecha muy activa en nuestros países, la guerra en Europa que impacta en nuestros estados. No obstante ellos, hay que dar la lucha, hay que dar la pelea en Barcelona, como se hizo en las conferencias anteriores. En la conferencia del doctor Stephen Ball encontraremos las herramientas para pensar esa disputa de la universidad como derecho o como negocio. El doctor Stephen Ball es considerado un eminente investigador del campo de las políticas educativas. Entre otros aspectos de su rica trayectoria destacamos: es profesor emérito de Sociología de la Educación en el Instituto de Educación de la Universidad de Londres. Ocupa la cátedra Carl Mannheim en Sociología de la Educación en la misma institución. Ha recibido premios honoríficos como miembro de la Royal Society of Art, miembro de la Academia de Ciencias Sociales, miembro de la Academia Británica y más recientemente la distinción Kappa Delta Phi. Recibió el honoris causa de la Universidad de Turkey, Finlandia, y de la Universidad de Leicester. Es cofundador y editor del Journal de Education Policy. Es autor de una enorme obra, imposible de mencionar aquí, que tiene alrededor de 30 libros y alrededor de 200 artículos en revistas científicas y capítulos de libros. Pero no deja de publicar y no deja de sorprendernos Stephen Ball, porque muy recientemente ha publicado 2 novelas, está incursionando en la ficción, y créanme que bien interesante su trabajo, porque además el contexto en el que se desarrolla, lo voy a traducir: la muerte de un examinador externo y muerte en la Torre de Cristal, se desarrolla en el espacio de la universidad. Yo no le he preguntado a él, pero voy a hacer una hipótesis o voy a decir algo que después se lo voy a preguntar. Creo que en el texto, o por lo menos en el primero, que es el que llevo leído, creo que tenemos herramientas para analizar la micropolítica de la universidad, porque nos vamos a ver muy reflejados en lo que pasa ahí adentro con este investigador, con este que intenta dilucidar este crimen o estos crímenes que han ocurrido en la universidad en la década del 80. Bueno, Stephen, nuevamente gracias. Thank you very much. And nothing. You speak.
Muchas gracias, Estela. Gracias por la invitación a hablar hoy. Lamento no poder hablar en castellano porque tengo falta de practicar en castellano. Al momento vivo por 6 meses en el año en España, pero el idioma de mi casa no es castellano, es catalán. Y el resultado es falta de práctica. Entonces, hablo en inglés. Gracias. I want to talk today about the Gordy University. I want to start with a quotation from the work of Ansgar Allen, who is an author whose work I find to be fascinatingly different in relation to thinking about the current state of education. And he writes this, he says, under the economic yoke of advanced liberalism, today's university is distinguished not by its greyness and economic subjugation, but by a gaudy proliferation of colour. It has become the rampant breeding ground for jobbing academics in search of the next big idea. Despite the bottom line mentality that besets it, where institutional coffers must be serviced before all else, economic restrictions are swiftly transformed into entrepreneurial opportunities, available only to those bold enough to reach out and grasp them. I say this and I quote this because it's important, I think, to understand the story of neoliberalism is not a dour and grey one, or not simply a dour and grey one. It's a complex, multifaceted, subtle and nuanced story that is full of colour and opportunities and possibilities. The opportunity to be excellent, to succeed, to make the most of yourself, to become something that you were not before. It is something, an opportunity to be an academic who is relevant in the current context to those who determine what it is that counts as relevance. I also wanted to start by saying that my account of neoliberalism and higher education cannot be simply a cold and objective one. Because I will be dealing with my own experience, and I will also be dealing with and talking about subjectivity itself. What I say rests in part on my autobiography, on my own life in higher education. And as I come to the end of a long career in higher education, I have to say that I do so with regret and with sadness and anger about what it is that higher education has become and what it is that I have become. I began work in a higher education system that was relatively small, although also quite elite, but fairly autonomous and predominantly scholarly. And the idea of academic freedom was relatively unchallenged. This was the University of Sussex in England, and teaching at Sussex was innovative, adventurous, and experimental. Now I find myself in a Yamativa University and in a very diverse and segmented mass system of higher education that recruits, or did until recently, large numbers of overseas students, particularly in the case of UCL, students from China, who are primarily intended to generate income rather than to be educated. Higher education institutions are now essentially businesses, and for the most part, growth trumps scholarship. These institutions are managed by specialist leaders, and spaces for democratic decision-making and opportunities for dissent have been minimized or erased entirely. In all of this, what I was and what higher education was when I got my first job at the University of Sussex is very different to what I am now and what higher education is now. That's in many ways a very obvious statement to make, but the extent of change, the nature of change and the modalities of change involved in all of this that make up that difference have been dramatic and profound, to say the least. So we have changed and been changed together, higher education and I. The meaning and experience of working and learning in higher education have changed. And the vehicle, the driver, the key element of that change is neoliberalism. The neoliberal regime has wrought massive changes across the higher education system, as it has other aspects and levels of education across the globe. But it's important to think about what I mean, what we should understand by neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, as I see it, is a powerful duality. It has two complex, interrelated aspects to it, which both need to be understood to understand neoliberalism itself. On the one hand, it is structural and grandiose. Neoliberalism, it's about markets and market relations. It's about competition, about deregulating systems of provision and privatizing them. It's about returns on investment and the possibilities of profit. It's about global flows of investment capital, about bottom lines and share prices. It is about creating ever more opportunities for profit. But also, at the same time, and in a complementary fashion, it is also about the mundane, the quotidian, and the personal. It is about who we are and what we have become. It is about how we think about ourselves, our relation to ourselves and to others. And in that respect, it is also about how we represent ourselves and how we are represented, how we are calculated and made up as social subjects. So neoliberalism is about what is out there. It is about markets in education, markets in higher education. It is about profits, about competition. It's about exchange. But it's also about in here. It's also about what goes on in our heads and in our souls. It is about how we think, how we interpret the world, how we make sense of our experience. And we can't understand the one aspect without understanding the other. They go together, they're intimately related. And between them, they bring about a change in our social relations and, as I said, our relation to ourselves. So the first aspect, the structural aspect of neoliberalism, and in particular neoliberalism in higher education, is apparent in many different respects. And it's very easy to find accounts of the financial opportunities which higher education now offers to business. Here are just a couple of examples. So the report the Higher Education Market 2021-2028 from Fortune Business Insights talks about a market which in US dollars in 2020 stood at $77.66 billion. This is a huge opportunity for profit, a huge incentive for business to get involved in education services of all kinds, in all kinds of contexts. And higher education is a key aspect of that. In the second part of the slide, we can see some further predictions and the distribution of the market and market opportunities across the different sectors, post-secondary, secondary, primary, etc. There again are enormous sums being quoted here. And this is the basis of the attraction of business to the education sector. In all these respects, as Michel Foucault puts it, what neoliberalism does is it reinforces at the epistemological, political, and ethical levels the possibility of giving an economic interpretation of a whole domain previously thought to be non-economic. So this is the insertion of economic thinking and business thinking into areas that were previously seen to be separate and previously seen to be governed by different epistemological sensibilities and ethical sensibilities. That is what, or that is how neoliberalism operates. But we, as I tried to indicate already, in order to understand neoliberalism, we have to understand it as a set of techniques or practices that operate in and around and on us in our everyday lives. And in particular, in relation to higher education, I'm thinking about the proliferation of measurements, of evaluations, of comparisons, of the allocation of roles of responsibility to virtually everybody in the education sector, the use of calculation, the calculation of everything, of equity, of impact, of employment outcomes, of quality of teaching. And these are rendered through systems of review and appraisal and through the setting of targets and benchmarks, which we are encouraged or required to achieve. In the words of Ian McGimpsey, this involves making the subject a site of regulatory intervention. The subject is increasingly, the social subject is increasingly defined in these terms, and I'll elaborate that further as I go on. So we're now, as Jenny Osger aptly puts it, governed by numbers, generally in our social lives and specifically within higher education. Numbers rate and compare and allocate us to categories as successful, as failures, as average, as improving, as working towards. And numbers define our work, our value to our colleagues, to our organization, to ourselves. They measure our effectiveness, and in a myriad of other ways, they work to inform and construct what it is that we are, who it is that we have become. So we're subject to numbers, and we become numbered subjects. And in these ways also, neoliberalism insinuates itself into our practice as academics, as teachers, as researchers. And Alex Rushworth puts this very nicely. He writes, for instance, a performance indicator like the journal impact factor was routinely mobilized informally in researchers' decision-making as an ad hoc standard against which to evaluate the likely uses of information and resources, and in deciding whether time and resources should be spent pursuing them. In other words, there is a shift underway from the intrinsic value and worth of research towards seeing it entirely or predominantly in terms of its extrinsic value. How will it be understood? How will it be evaluated in terms of a set of numbers derived from the impact factors of the journals in which your work is published? So we no longer think about journal articles in terms of their intellectual contribution, their intellectual value. Increasingly, we think about them in terms of their numerical value and ultimately their economic value to us and to our institution. So within all this, in relation to all these changes, we have to think about neoliberalism as a worldview that on the one hand promises us liberation by reconciling economic deregulation with personal freedoms. It opens up borders. It creates the possibility of cosmopolitanism and globalization and the promise of increased prosperity for all. It's a world of new opportunities, a world without boundaries. Students can now travel across the world and attend universities almost anywhere they wish. Universities market themselves on the global scale, attempting to tempt those students into their institution. But at the same time, the neoliberal self, the neoliberal subject, becomes a product to be sold, a walking advertisement for their institution, a jumble of assets to be invested in, to be managed and developed, what we might call the gaudy academic. But equally, within all this, there is an inventory of liabilities to be pruned, to be outsourced, to be hedged against, to be minimized. There are those who can be excellent, can be successful, can improve themselves, can stand for the value and the attributes of their institution. But at the same time, there is always the possibility of being understood, perceived, constructed as a liability, as a failure, as inadequate, as unproductive, as ineffective. This is in some ways a version of what Marx called the creative destruction of capital. Neoliberalism both creates new opportunities, but also destroys lives, destroys morale, destroys conditions of employment. But within all of this, what comes into view is a social subject we might call academic economicus, a new kind of social and educational subject, a social and educational subject who is constantly making rational cost-benefit decisions, like which journal is worth publishing in terms of its impact factor. And this takes place within an architecture of nudges and incentives produced by indexes and rewards. And through writing of ourselves as data, we produce a kind of meta-self, a numerical self, another self, which is a celebration of our excellence on our productivity, which is represented most essentially in our H index, where we are reduced in our totality and our complexity, our career, our contribution to academic life, our teaching, our research becomes a single number, becomes the H index. This is the multiplication of the individual and the constitution of an additional self, an H index self, as Mark Puster puts it. It's an exercise in pragmatics. So all of this changes our experience as teachers and also the experience of learners. And I'll come back to learners in a moment. It involves the ascendance of market-based pressures in higher education, and this prompts course shifts in the experience of higher education. So public universities are recast as though they were and act as though they were marketized corporations that generate economic returns to their nations. And these institutions, like mine, have adopted corporatized theories of action. The logics of their decision-making are driven by a corporate mentality, are driven by the objectives and priorities of growth, of income maximization, of increasing student recruitment. And these priorities are reflected in the changing strategic and managerial orientations of the institution and in their formal structures and processes. And at the heart of those structures and processes, there is a restructuring of academic labor, how labor is valued, conditions of work, conditions of pay, conditions of employment, the nature of daily life, but also the adopting of strategic enrollment management and market-related curricula, the move towards composite degrees, towards bite-sized curricula, whereby students can put together something for themselves in terms of what makes sense to them in relation to their own strategic decision-making. And it also involves a reworking of organizational structures. As I've said already, the introduction, the role of specialized leaders, and the changing form of funding streams. And all of this becomes a driver for competition between universities, a competition for funding, competition for students, competition for research opportunities, and at its most reductive, a competition for ranking positions. So the widening possibilities for profit making in the education sector cannot be reduced to a simple increase in the exchange of commodities, but it has to be understood as inextricably intertwined with the colonization of the field by commercially provided systems based upon models developed for business and for industry, which are then borrowed and implemented. And this involves a basic reshaping of the forms of teaching and learning, together with a restructuring and reorganizing of organizations, groups, and individuals to function and behave as if they were corporations. And Maurizio Lazzarato, who is one of the thinkers I find very useful in helping me think about neoliberalism, he puts this very succinctly and very nicely when he says the individual, the institution, and our social relations become modeled on and microcosms of the business. They become organized on the individual's function as a molecular fraction of capital. So as academics, we become a business. Our own practice becomes a personal individual corporation driven by growth, profit maximization, creation of new opportunities, and being valued in terms of our excellence and our contribution to institutional and national economic well-being. Or to put it another way, use a different terminology, to use George Ritz's term, this is the McDonaldization of higher education. Students are made as consumers of higher education, who can, depending on the institution, buy degrees made up, as I said, of bite-sized credit-related modules. Lecturers become, in this McDonaldized higher education system, facilitators of student experience. Organizational decision-making is driven by league table competition. And as Rissler says, the impact of McDonaldization is clear, for example, in the way that students increasingly relate to professors as if they were workers in the fast food industry, delivering bite-sized knowledge in tasty portions to be consumed as quickly as possible. And all of that relationship, the consumer relationship, is also driven by the proliferation of systems of rating and comparison. For example, in the United States and now in other countries around the world, you can access Rate My Professors and put your own measures, your own comments online, just as you would for any other service you give a rating 1 to 5, you offer comments, and then these are made available to other consumers to enable them to make informed choices about their higher education experience. And this then generates lists and rankings, and again, in the United States, but also elsewhere, you can access lists of the best 300 professors and look at how they're rated and ranked and commented on by their students. So these consumer relations and these consumer rankings also contribute to the proliferation of indicators and measures within which and by which we must live. And Roger Burrows, another English academic, writes about this as living with the H index. And in a paper he published in 2012, he lists the variety and range of different indicators and measures to which he himself is subject and to which he must attend, and the expectations that are attached to these. So it's expected that we have an H index of a certain level. It is expected that we publish in journals with an average impact factor of a certain level. We have an undergraduate teaching load, which is appropriate to the institutional norm, although it may fall above or go fall below or be above that average, obviously. We have a PhD supervision load and a throughput of PhD students in terms of a yearly average. We generate an annual grants income for him in the top quartile for the social sciences. We work within, and this is something that operates in the British system, a system of research excellence monitoring and ranking. And the expectation, again, as that he confronts is that his institution should be in the top 5 nationally in terms of their research excellence ranking. He's expected to receive module student evaluation scores in the top quartile. He's expected to work within a school with poor national student survey results, placing it in the bottom quartile of the subject nationally, but he must work to improve that position. And he goes on, and indeed in the period since, the 10 years since 2012, there is an increase further in the number and type of systems of measurement and ranking that constructs the framework within which we work as academics. And this is true, of course, not simply of higher education, but the production and collection, the management, analysis and interpretation, and the maintenance of flows of data of this sort are part of the everyday life in modern learning and knowing organizations at whatever level, from preschool to school, further higher education and elsewhere. So what is required of us in all this and in relation to these measures and indicators is a maximizing of our academic self. They require from us exercises in inflation, self-inflation and perfection, and the generation of impact for our work, stories which generate or demonstrate the impact of our work. So we're incited and hailed to recognize ourselves in the terms of these indicators and measures and rankings. As Judith Butler puts it, these constitute a regime of truth that offers the terms that make self-recognition possible. So these become the ways that we understand ourselves as academics. These become the ways we make sense of who we are and what we do. They provide a language for us to describe ourselves and to represent ourselves. And they reduce what we do, as I've said already, in many cases, to a numerical form. So they render aspects of our teaching and learning into graphs and charts. They're transformed into statistical indicators. And in the process of that, lives as such, social lives, as Nicholas Rose put it, they disappear behind percentages and decimal points and quotients. And in the context of education, numerical knowledge affects and represents the reduction of complex personal, social, and moral realities for the purposes of assessment and comparison and competition. A process that Nicholas Rose neatly describes as a rhetorical technique of black boxing. In other words, this is the hegemony of the number through technical, mathematical, statistical, and scientific discourses that serve to obfuscate the complexity and fragility of the processes and social relations and commitments that lie behind and beyond the production of a number. They become irrelevant, they become unnecessary. We know all we need to know when we know the number. So this involves a massive oversimplification and invisibilization and invalidation of categories of experience that many of us see as fundamental to the educative experience itself. The numerical discourse intensifies the commodification of education by reducing and sidelining emotional, affective, social, and moral relations. The numerical articulation represents an epistemological framework that facilitates commodification, not only cohering multiple practices and discourses, but actually shaping them. And this is a key way in which the ethical and social space of education is reformed and reformed. So within all this, we must fabricate ourselves. And the CV, the curriculum vitae, is one vehicle for this. It's a form of data double or abstracted knowledge in which a person makes themselves up for the consumption of others in order to impress others, drawing upon available resources, which include measures and indicators and quotients of various kinds. And this data double, this way of representing ourselves adheres to our body and travels with us as a meta self, as a narrative of our excellence and our productivity, which is both expansive and reductive. And one of the very simple things that has changed over the time of my own career in higher education is the nature of the CV, the curriculum vitae itself. For many years at the beginning of my career, the normal CV may be 2-3 pages long, a general outline of someone's career, the positions they held, some of their major publications and their research interests. Now, as I see them in relation to job applications, promotion applications, a typical CV is between 50 and 60 pages long. They include data, numbers related to almost every aspect of academic activity and academic work. The number of courses taught, the number of presentations given, the number of PhDs examined, the number of students completed, etc., etc. This becomes a way of demonstrating our productivity, but is at the same time a way of reducing ourselves and abstracting ourselves in numerical terms. But so I've noted already there are two aspects to the idea of excellence. Over and against excellence, there is failure. And within the neoliberal regime of higher education, there is the production not only of the opportunity to be successful, but the fate of being a failure, of being unsuccessful, of being unproductive. And this produces insecurity and is related to and part of the financial flexibility of the corporate institution of higher education. So when I first got my job in higher education, almost all academics were employed full-time. But if I can quote Stuart McFarlane, he says, or said, again, 2012, now more than a third of all UK academics work part-time, while fixed-term contracts are also the norm. The effect of job insecurity goes well beyond those on fixed-term and part-time contracts. It affects everyone's sense of security and puts subtle pressure on the extent to which academics feel they can afford to be independent. Sustaining a disinterested attitude to the results of our own research is tougher when the successful outcome of a research project and publications confirming this are essential to keeping our job. So there is an intimate and direct relation between numbers, between the way in which we represent ourselves in terms of our meta self, our data double, and our security of employment and our financial security. But those measures and indicators can also be used by institutions, as I said, to give them financial flexibility. If you can employ more and more people on fixed contracts, short-term contracts, hour-related contracts, that gives you the opportunity to move your resources around the institution, to not renew contracts, to not employ people at the same level of contract employment, contract salary. So that again, there's a relationship between the immediate experience of the academic and the corporate decision-making of the institution within the overall regime of the neoliberal higher education system. And also in relation to this, and going back to the student and the learner, these indicators and measures also, as I suggested already, generate data which can be used by the student to make informed decisions about the institution they might want to attend. And they are encouraged to think about that decision-making very much in terms of their own cost-benefit rationalities. Will going to this institution, studying this subject on this course, put me in a position of advantage in relation to entry into the labour market? And universities now are ranked informally and formally in terms of how they articulate with the labour market, both locally, regionally, nationally, and increasingly globally. So when I acting as a student, wanting to inform myself about opportunities I might have to study in an Argentinian university, I was quickly able to access a whole range of different sites that wanted to tell me about the quality and ranking of those institutions. So I could go, for example, to topuniversities.com and look at their ranking. I could go to mastersportal.com and compare that. I could go to universityguru.com. I could go to Webometrics, and I could go on. There are numerous other sites on which universities are ranked, compared, and at which students are encouraged to inform themselves to make decisions about their choice of university. So on one of these, I forget which one, it tells me that beginning your career in one of the best universities in Argentina to study your dream course is one of the biggest decisions you'll ever make. It will raise your personal worth and ultimately your worth in the job market. Argentina's universities and colleges are quite notable for the quality of education they offer. The schools in Argentina continue to offer prestigious bachelor's, master's, and PhD programs for smart, driven adventurers like you. So in all of this, we see again the generation of a conceptual framework and a language for the students to think about themselves. The students are encouraged to think of themselves as dreamers, somebody who dreams of a job, an ideal job for them in the future. And what will be the way to achieve that job? What will be the right course, the right university for them, which will put them in the best possible position for them to realize their dream? But also they're adventurers, they're driven, they have goals, they must make rational decisions, they must be smart about the decisions that they make. So these websites and these schemes of measurement and ranking provide a language for thinking about ourselves, thinking about what we do and the decisions that we make. And these websites are also an indication that as well as the primary source of financial opportunity, of profit making in education through the delivery of direct services, there are also a number of other economies and other markets which have a synergy with or a parasitic relation to education. So there are private coaching schools and colleges which will prepare you for entry into the university of your choice or your dreams. Once in the university, you can maximize the possibility of the grades and degree that you might be awarded by buying your coursework and your essays online. And these are available widely now, these websites that offer essays to students. And concomitantly, given that some students are buying their essays online, institutions now are encouraged to buy software and programs that provide for plagiarism detection. So one form of market generates a second form of market in relation to higher education. And of course, for the researcher now, there are a multitude of commercial journals that are willing to publish your paper, reviewed or not, at cost. If you can pay for it, they will publish it. And if you can get it published, then you can add it to your CV. Although, of course, these commercial journals do not have very significant, or in some cases, no impact factors, are not recognized on international ranking systems, and therefore you may be disadvantaging yourself at the same time in the way in which your work is evaluated in your institution or by others. In all of this, these articulations of the economic, financial version of higher education, in all of this, the social and the economic blur or converge as more and more of the social and the educational and the psychological and the interpersonal aspects of our lives are opened up to the possibility of enumeration and calculation. And this is reinforced further by the way in which research is funded, in particular government research. This is the UK Agency for Social and Economic Research, the Economic and Social Research Council. And on their website, research is now, or their funding is now referred to as investment. And here it refers to a list highlighting research from all of our investments. So they no longer simply fund research in higher education, they invest in research in higher education. And what that suggests, of course, what that indicates is that a return is expected, that there is a return on the investment. And those returns may be of different kinds, but in general, they are referred to in the UK system as impacts. So it is now expected that your research has an impact, and that specifically that impact, the impact of your research is measurable in some ways, that it can generate indicators which then stand for its value. And again, as I said earlier on, the danger in all of this is the evacuation from research of its intellectual value and the replacement of that by a calculative or financial value. At the same time, of course, the possibility of higher education as a political act, a political experience is displaced or marginalized or subjugated. So education as a public responsibility in a society of democratic and ethical practice is replaced by education as a production process, a site of technical practice, and as a private commodity, something which can be exchanged in the labour market by the student, or something which can be exchanged in terms of social or economic impact in terms of research. It becomes a means-end logic, which is summed up in that very supremely technico-managerial question, which is what works? Does your research contribute to what works in the world? So this constructs around us a research economy within which we work. And each of these transactions, each of the transactions within this research economy is monitored and recorded, and a surplus of information is produced. A surplus of truth, in effect, a surplus of truth in relation to us, the truths that are told about us, as well as the truths that we tell about the world. And this has many aspects to it. So through our research, we can earn income directly and indirectly for our university. Our research income contributes to the budget of the university. But we can also improve our outputs and our impacts through attracting research funding. It becomes part of our representation of ourselves, our meta-self, our data double. It's something that we can put in our CV. But also at the same time, as social researchers at least, we can contribute through the impact that we can make to the effectiveness of business, of government, in making or saving money or driving up performance or quality, or the work of government itself in terms of the management of the population. So the neoliberal researcher in the neoliberal university, the Lamativa researcher in the Lamativa University, it is malleable and plastic rather than committed, is flexible rather than principled. We will seek out research funding wherever it can be found, avoiding thinking about who is funding the research and what is being funded. And we become, again, as Jenny Oscar puts it, entrepreneurial researchers. We become contract truth seekers in the data market. And of course, we're increasingly not only competing with others like us in other universities, but also competing with the increasing number of private truth producers, private research organizations. And as a consequence, our research becomes emaciated. We subjugate the social to capital, and high-minded questions about freedom are answered by low-minded mechanisms like the citation index. If I try to put all of that together and come to an end, one of the most useful ways, mechanisms I've found for thinking about neoliberalism comes from the work of Maurizio Lazzarato, Italian post-structural theorist. And he suggests that neoliberalism is constituted by 5 states of being. And he talks about those as being individualization, inequality, insecurity, depoliticization, and financialization. And they sum up the things I've been trying to say today. So individualization is evident in the self-interested academic and the competitive academic, and the role of ranking and comparison to set us one against the other, to separate us out, to identify the successful, the unsuccessful, to identify the improvements or declines in our performance. Because there's a tremendous presentism in all of this. We're only as good as our most recent indicators, our most recent review or appraisal or student rankings. And the concomitant of that, of course, is a decline in collegial relations and the increased difficulty of acting collegially, working together. Although I have to say that in my own system, my union, we are currently involved in a long process, a system of strike action against our university employers, which has been going on for more than a year and continues on a regular basis. Second aspect of, or state of being, Lazzarato talks about is inequality. And we can think about this in numerous ways. 2 examples, which I've talked about already. One is that the ranking of universities is related to the opportunities offered to students in terms of access to quality of teaching, the qualifications of the teaching staff, the possibilities of points of access to the labour market. But also at the same time, those inequalities are related to social and economic advantage and disadvantage. There is a clear relationship between the reputation and status of universities and the socio-demographic profile of their intake. But also inequality in relation to the experience of higher education for academics and researchers. Who is employed full-time? Who is rewarded by promotion and by pay rises, as against those who experience and inhabit higher education on the basis of precarity, hoping that a contract will be renewed, hoping to be offered further hours, greater hours of work. So inequality runs through the system in various ways. And as I've already indicated, it's related to insecurity of employment, insecurity of future employment in relation to students. And concomitant to that, again, as I said, it involves depoliticization. It renders education into something that is calculable and financial, that is articulated in terms of economic benefit, rather than articulated in terms of democratic principles or intellectual principles, or the development of civic virtues and citizenship skills. Rather than offering students the opportunity to think better, it offers a commodity in terms of a particular certificate or outcome, which can be used on the basis of exchange in other fields or systems. And underpinning all of that, as I started with, are systems of financialization, whereby higher education is now a financial asset. It's an opportunity for investment. And this is, of course, very evident in the private sector. Globally, universities are now routinely bought and sold by university corporations. Some corporations are expanding, growing their profile of universities one by one, or in some cases, taking over whole systems and adding them to their portfolio of universities. So in all of this, something has changed in higher education. Many academics are exhausted, stressed, overloaded, suffering from insomnia, feeling anxious, feeling hurt, feeling guilty, feeling a sense of being out of place. There's a deep, affective, somatic crisis that threatens to overwhelm us. And we know this, and yet somehow we are unable to reassert ourselves. And if we are to escape the neoliberal regime, if we are to refuse neoliberalism, given what I've argued, my point would be that we must begin and we must think in our heads. We must think about what it is we have become, who it is that we are now. And if we do not like what we find, if we do not like what it is that we have become, then we must refuse it. We must not be that. We must find a different kind of relation to ourselves and to others. In other words, we must struggle on the site of subjectivity. If neoliberalism operates in important ways in relation to the construction of our subjectivity, then if we are going to struggle against neoliberalism, we must struggle against what we've become. We must struggle against the subjectivity that has been offered to us, that represents us. We must become firm and clear rather than plastic and flexible. We must become value focused rather than number focused. We must be concerned with the usefulness of knowledge rather than its monetary worth. So we must move outside of or resist, avert these gridded and measured spaces, comparison and ranking, and attempt to dilute their power. And that becomes an ethical matter, a matter of our relation to ourselves as much as it is a political one. So the task becomes that, as Foucault puts it, of detaching the power of truth from the forms of hegemony within which it operates at the present time. We must deny the truths that are told about us. We must find a different way to be truthful about ourselves. This may not be a sufficient basis for the refusal or resistance to neoliberalism, but I would argue that it's a necessary one. If we do not confront what it is that we have become, we are not confronting neoliberalism in all its nuances and its complexity. Neoliberalism is a slouching, slavering beast, lurches now through all corners of the education system, and it creates havoc in its wake, remaking education in its own image. And so we need now more than ever to begin to think about how education might be different from what it is that it's become. Not different in the sense of going back to what it was before. I don't want to recreate higher education as it was when I started, but a different set of possibilities that we have not yet thought. In other words, we must create spaces in which it becomes possible to think education differently. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen Ball, for the fantastic conferencia, por este fantástico momento. Aunque las reacciones que tengo son de que, bueno, han quedado impresionadas de tus análisis y de tus palabras. Hay preguntas, hay preguntas, hay varias preguntas sobre, voy a intentar traducir porque hay preguntas en portugués, hay preguntas en inglés, hay preguntas en castellano. Tenemos un público enorme, en algún momento 273 personas, mucho de Brasil, mucha gente de Brasil. Tienes allí los académicos de Brasil son muy seguidores de tus teorías y de tus producciones. Bueno, por supuesto de Argentina también y de otros países, pero a ver, voy a hacer una pregunta que me parece que resume otras, que hay las mismas inquietudes. Pregunta Renata, un placer escucharlo, dice Renata, un placer escucharlo, doctor Boll. Le agradezco todas sus enseñanzas. Tal como lo venimos estudiando, el neoliberalismo se ha tornado en un régimen de verdad, dominante o hegemónico. Mi pregunta es, ¿observa otros regímenes de verdad o discursos que compiten con esa hegemonía? ¿Qué movimientos podría considerar contrahegemónicos al neoliberalismo académico? Y si existen, ¿en qué regiones del mundo se expresan con mayor fuerza? Pregunta, ¿puede the Open Science Movement ser una alternativa al neoliberalismo de la educación superior?
Various attempts around the world in different countries to either retrieve a version of higher education as it was prior to neoliberalism, or to construct alternatives that are not directly subject to neoliberalism. And those are valuable and important in all sorts of ways. And they are articulated very often in terms of relations via the internet or the commons or open movements of various kinds. And a couple of them I've been involved in myself. But I still think that the problem with these, there are two problems in some respects. One is that they present themselves, not in every case, but in some cases at least, as alternatives. And the tyranny of the alternative has the strange effect in many cases of connecting us back to what it is that we do not want to be. We become an alternative to that. We use the language that defined us in ways that we found uncomfortable to redefine ourselves. What I've tried to argue for in things I've been writing recently is the need to abandon the language of alternatives and to speak instead, or to search instead, for a language of difference, to start somewhere else rather than to start on the basis of an alternative. I can see in some respects that's a kind of pedantic argument, but I think it's important. Usually when I speak like this, on occasions like this, in various different settings, live or virtually, the first question is normally, what is the alternative? And I want to try and escape from the tyranny of alternatives and epistemologically frame the problem of refusal in a different way. The other thing is, it goes back to the point I finished with in my presentation, which is that these different or alternative or other ways of relating together in higher education often deal with structures and systems, ways of doing things differently, but not necessarily addressing the key question, what I see to be the key question, which is subjectivity. In a way, I don't think that we can be different until we confront that which we have become. We have to understand what neoliberalism has made us into before we can struggle against it, or before we can articulate ourselves differently. So it's a very, in one respect at least, it's a very personal struggle, an encounter with ourselves, and a resort to a refusal or a set of refusals that are set against the mundane and quotidian experience of neoliberalism. I won't do that. I won't be like that. I will not represent myself in that way. So there are other possibilities that are out there, that they're not large scale, there are not very many of them, and they are valuable. But I think there are still other issues that we need to come to grips with to think otherwise about higher education.
Thank you, Stephen. Muchos saludos y muchos agradecimientos por tu obra, por esta conferencia que es tan esclarecedora. Muchas preguntas, no sé si vamos a poder, vamos a abusar un poco de tu generosidad, pero bueno, tampoco podemos extender mucho más allá la transmisión. Aquí Tulio pregunta sobre la profesión de los maestros, de profesión teacher, en el contexto del actual capitalismo. Las instituciones de educación superior o la universidad impone reglas de profesionalismo a los maestros, como sucede en la high school, dice. Bueno, creo que está preguntando también sobre las reglas o los condicionantes a los profesores en las escuelas. Esta yo creo que ya está contestada, pero bueno, Raquel pregunta, Stephen, ¿cómo crees, how do you believe, que este neoliberal contexto impacta en las identidades académicas? ¿Alguna otra cuestión más? ¿Alguna otra pregunta? ¿Cuál es la alternativa al investigador emprendedor? ¿Existen de hecho espacios y estrategias de resistencia o alternativas en las universidades de hoy? Y esta que es más general, pero bien interesante, Ángela, dice, muchas gracias por las reflexiones. ¿De qué forma se puede combatir cuando se vive en un país muy neoliberal como Chile?
The various comments and questions revolve around the same issue, the issue I tried to introduce at the end. Yes, how does although again this may be semantic, I'd like to try and think about refusing neoliberalism rather than resisting it. By refusing neoliberalism, again, as I say, what I mean is that we begin by refusing or confronting and perhaps refusing what it is we've become, how we act, how we relate to ourselves, and how we relate to others. And that will then inevitably confront us with both some very difficult ethical decisions, some very difficult personal decisions, and some very difficult political decisions. And in terms of research, that would come down to a simple question very often. Do I apply for this research? Do I accept the grounds on which this call for research and research funding is set up? Do I accept the values that has created this research stream as a priority for government or for my institution, which is then attached to funding and then becomes an incentive to me to apply in order to gather the esteem and indeed to collect the budget for my department that this research offers and entails. And that is a very difficult refusal. It's something that enhances the precarity of our position. And it's much easier for me to make the argument that is an important refusal to contemplate, because I'm at the end of my career rather than at the beginning. I have very little at stake in terms of the refusals that I make, and I understand full well that for young academics who are entering the system or people in mid-career, decisions like that are much more difficult and can involve financial hardship or put their position or their job or their reputation at risk. But that is the situation in which we find ourselves. We cannot confront and resist neoliberalism as an abstract system that is separate from us and our behavior and our acts and our subjectivity. Neoliberalism operates is only possible by and through producing certain kinds of entrepreneurial, interest maximizing, calculating, rational subjects. And the extent to which we continue as one of those subjects, we continue to support, reinforce, and disseminate the values and practices of neoliberalism. I don't think there's any escape from that dilemma. We can, and it is important at certain times, as the case in my uni at the moment, to strike against our university employers. That's important. It's important, as has happened in Chile in particular, a number of times in recent years, that people take their grievances to the street and confront those grievances en masse. But for me, that is only part of the struggle. The other part of the struggle, as I try to say, is set within the immediate, everyday ethical decisions that we make about who it is that we are and what it is we've become, how we act, the decisions that we make, how we respond to the incentives and nudges that the neoliberal regime creates for us. If we speak about, or speak against, or write against neoliberalism, but are a neoliberal in our head, then we're not going to achieve any change. It's only when enough people, in effect, become willing to refuse what it is they've become that something dramatic may be possible.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much. Paula Speller dice, no he escuchado del conferencista menciones a las conferencias regionales y mundiales de educación superior de la UNESCO, Córdoba 2018 y antes Cartagena y La Habana, marcos de resistencia y construcción de procesos diferentes y alternativos. Marcos, al iniciar la presentación de Stephen Ball, precisamente enmarqué esta conferencia señalando esto que acabas de decir. Me parece importante que podamos reafirmar esta posición de los latinoamericanos que llevamos a las anteriores conferencias mundiales y que está en línea con este posicionamiento crítico que nos trae y que nos ayuda a repensar la universidad como derecho y la justicia social en la universidad. Has pedido la palabra, el doctor Pablo Speller es un colega de una importante universidad de Brasil, ha sido director de la Organización de Estados Iberoamericanos muy recientemente, hace alrededor de 7, 8 años, y ha pedido la palabra porque además pertenecemos a un grupo que es el grupo Kairos, y al grupo Enlaces, que son los grupos latinoamericanos de universidades, de asociaciones de docentes, de asociaciones de estudiantes, asociaciones de trabajadores de la universidad, de las universidades y de las instituciones de educación superior, que llevarán a Barcelona la próxima semana unos documentos de resistencia, tanto Enlaces como Kairos, como UDUAL, como la Asociación de Universidades del Grupo de Montevideo. Con el permiso de Stephen y de todos ustedes, vamos a escuchar la palabra de Pablo. ¿Estás ahí, Pablo?
Sí, hola, buenos días, buenas
hola.
tardes. ¿Qué tal todo? Gracias, Estela.
Estás muteado, Pablo.
Un placer estar con todos ustedes. Congratulations, Professor Stephen Ball. Excellent. I was at your first university, as a matter of fact, quite a few years ago at the Institute of Development Studies. It's an excellent university. What I would like to say is that, in my view, universities have always been a space of confrontation in one way or another. And they still are, and they will always be, I think, despite the internet and so on. And in this sense, I think, as Stella has just said, and at the beginning it was said as well, the regional conferences of higher education of UNESCO in Latin America, in La Habana, in Cartagena, in 2018 in Córdoba, Argentina, were also spaces of confrontations. And we will have quite strong confrontations in Barcelona next week with the World Bank, with international organizations which have been captured by neoliberalism or were organized and instituted by neoliberal interests, whereby higher education has become an asset and a business, as you have said very well. So my point is, yes, I agree with you, but I think that we should continue this confrontation and this struggle and this debate at our universities, and especially in Latin America. I speak for Latin America, but I think that also applies to universities in the Northern Hemisphere, which is the case in Britain and in other parts of the world. But I think the universities are a very important and crucial and strategic space for that confrontations. I don't think we have to invent, to build up anything alternative in the sense of moving out from the university and constructing something that, yes, we have research institutes and ONGs, NGOs, and so on. That's okay. And we are in different organizations, as Stella has mentioned, like Kairos, where we are, and we will be in Barcelona with Enlaces, with UDUAL, and so many other organizations confronting those institutions like the ones I have mentioned. So, and I was a bit surprised because I didn't hear any comment from you regarding UNESCO, regarding the conferences. Would you have any comments on that, as the conference, that third one, will start just next week in Barcelona. Well, congratulations again, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Pablo. Thank you for your comments. And yes, I cannot disagree with you in terms of your urging, your argument for the need for the university to be a site of confrontation. And in a sense, that is the basis on which the meaning of the university rested in the prior to neoliberalism. It rested on the idea of confrontation in a number of ways: intellectual, ethical, political, moral, etc. I think the problem is that the possibilities of those confrontations are actually under threat in a variety of ways from neoliberalism, both in a very practical sense. In the UK now, the higher education sector has the second highest proportion of its workers who are part-time or have short-term contracts of any other sector of the economy apart from hospitality and tourism. I think that in itself is an incredible fact. So it means that the majority of those who teach, and usually these are exclusively teachers in higher education, many of those who teach in higher education are faced with ongoing precarity. Will their contract be renewed? And that undermines for many of them the possibility of participation in confrontation that makes them apparent, that raises their profile as someone who asks questions, who creates difficulties. So I think that is something that we need to think about and understand and try and address. The other thing I would say is that right at the beginning, Estella mentioned the context of COVID. And I see some people in some screens are wearing their masks now. And one of the effects of COVID at both school level and higher education is the extension, development of a trend towards the platformization of education. That is the creation of virtual education institutions that operate entirely online. And that platformization has given an enormous boost by COVID because, of course, universities closed, schools closed, people were not going to the institution, they were receiving their teaching and learning online. I don't know if it happened in Argentina, but across Europe and the United States, Microsoft and Google offered free their access to their educational platforms to schools, to governments, to students and to parents between March 2020 and September 2020. As a result of which they recruited hundreds of thousands of new subscribers, but also they reinforced and enforced the role of their platforms within education. And virtual higher education and in the United States, virtual education, school level education, are the fastest growing sectors of higher education and school education. And they provide little or no opportunity for confrontation. There's no sociality. They meet as we're meeting now, as disembodied faces who have a fleeting encounter which disappears as soon as we click off our Zoom. And that is also contributing in very powerful ways to undermining other values, older values and newer values in terms of higher education.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much. Muchas reacciones tenemos aquí en el chat que que te haremos llegar en su momento, porque son todas muy, muy cálidas, muy generosas, están todos muy agradecidos de tu... Hay muchas más cuestiones, muchas más preguntas, pero tenemos que cerrar la transmisión porque tenemos un periodo de... que creo que tenemos que organizar una conferencia presencial. Tú tienes que venir a Argentina y visitar a Tandil, disfrutar de las montañas de Tandil, un lugar maravilloso, y también en Córdoba, por supuesto. Así que bueno, esperamos que pronto podamos tenerte por aquí en los próximos años y poder disfrutar de, bueno, de tu generosidad, porque humanamente sos una persona muy generosa, muy cálida, y entonces da gusto, da placer siempre estar contigo. De parte de los organizadores estamos, bueno, muy agradecidos y vamos a seguir en contacto. Un abrazo, como te digo siempre, porque además tu español está muy bien, está muy bien tu español. Mejor que mi inglés.
Gracias. Gracias igualmente, y un abrazo muy fuerte. Y gracias por todos y todas las personas tienen parte de la conferencia. Muchas gracias.
Okay. Gracias, un abrazo muy fuerte. Hasta pronto. Muchas gracias a todos los que se conectaron, por todo el apoyo, y a las instituciones que han avalado esta conferencia, lo que muestra que la importancia que tiene la lectura de Stephen Ball en nuestra academia. Bueno,
Adeu, as we say in Catalunya. Adeu.
Chao. Adiós.
Adiós.
Hasta pronto.